All right, we are live. Thanks everyone for coming to this webinar. I'm very excited to be here today chatting about mentorship and creating a culture of a continuous learning. We have a great guest joining us today. We've got Nathan Goldstein from Together Platform. They're all about mentorship. They're all about learning. Oh, I'm getting some feedback somewhere. One second here. Where's that coming from? Here we go. Sorry about that, everybody. All right, one technical glitch out of the way. Let's move forward. There we go. If you're joining us, I always like to kind of see where people are joining us from, where you're coming from, and just kind of tell us, what the weather's like, where you're coming from, just to sort of get things rolling and get our commentary going a bit. While we're getting that going, I'm going to pass things over to Nathan just to do a quick introduction of himself, kind of why they started the Together platform and what it is he does there all day long. So Nathan, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I am Nathan. I'm a co-founder and head of product at Together Software. And Together Software is a company that helps organizations launch a mentoring program inside their organization and kind of bring all the best practices that we've seen, not only across our own customers, but even, to answer your question, Noah, earlier of why we started this, just some of our former employers who really excelled in running mentorship programs, and we wanted to bring those best practices to everybody around the world.
Cool. Awesome.
And so actually, just to add, as part of my role is in overseeing product development, I've seen probably thousands now of mentorship programs, and I'm also the person that everyone comes to with feature requests for. And so I do see a lot of the more kind of innovative or interesting ideas of how people want to incorporate mentoring programs to create that continuous learning culture at their company. So I'm happy to take questions at the end regarding that as well.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. And I love that you brought up the questions. We love questions. Please drop your questions in the comments. If anyone is having trouble putting questions in YouTube, they've just put a new sort of, I'm sure they call it a feature, making it that you do have to have a YouTube account to comment. But if you're having trouble, please feel free to join us on the LinkedIn Live side of things and comment there. We'll get those comments here and we can answer those questions as they pop up. So let us know what you're thinking, what questions you have, and we'll answer them as we go, or we'll wait till the end to answer those questions. But yeah, thanks Nathan for kind of giving us an introduction, kind of what you're doing. And I'm sure you have a really interesting perspective as a chief product officer, as you said, listening to all of the feature requests that people have in regards to their mentorship programs. But let's kind of like jump and kind of level set the conversation before we kind of talk more about mentorship programs and all that kind of stuff. But I'd like to hear how you define mentorship and how it's different than coaching. And if you in the audience have a definition of mentorship that you would want to share, love to see it in the comments as well. So, throw in your own definition of mentorship. Nathan, I'd love to hear your definition of mentorship and how it is different than coaching. I know those two sort of, those two items get used interchangeably a lot, but they're actually two very different things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, they are used very interchangeably. And I think that at the end of the day, people do have different definitions for them. I think it's helpful to have a definition, particularly for marketing mentorship or coaching program to your participants, and then having common expectations of what they're getting into, how to design one to be the best possible outcome. And so this is my definition, the one that we use at Together Software as well, is that we view coaching and mentoring as almost living on a spectrum in terms of how formal the relationship is. And there's a few dimensions that we think about. So think about these as a few criteria of, is this coaching or is this mentorship? The first criteria that I think about is this a evaluative relationship or not? I.e., is the mentee or coachee being evaluated on their performance or their improvement as they go in that relationship? So that's one criteria. Another is whether that advisor, mentor, coach is certified, paid, or has a, formal tools and methodologies that they are using to guide that relationship. And actually, part of this also implies an ability to standardize some exercises for the different people that you're advising or coaching, and take on many people at a time. So that's another dimension, is essentially that certification, or whether they're using specific tools or methodologies. A third is who drives the relationship between sessions. Is it more so on the mentee or coachee, or is it more so on the mentor or coach? And then lastly, the duration of that relationship. And actually, sorry, I will add one more, which is who typically gets access to coaching or mentoring inside an organization. So I'll talk about all of these. So on the coaching side, what's the kind of embodiment of that in terms of all those criteria is coaching tends to be more with a qualified or certified advisor, and they've got certain tools and methodologies that they're trained on, maybe diagnostic methodologies. And often it's even a paid interaction. There's a number of different companies that offer paid coaching services out there. BetterUp, Torch are examples. And you can find a career coach, a life coach, et cetera. So it's very common that that's a paid interaction, but doesn't necessarily have to be. You could even run your own, say, qualification process internally at your organization to designate coaches. The second is that it is a little bit more evaluative in terms of coaching versus mentoring, and that there's maybe really specific goals that you're tracking progress against. Maybe there's a diagnostic process that goes on of like, here are the areas that we want to work on, here are areas for development or weaknesses, and then really being careful to follow up over time and see that progress. So some examples of kinds of coaching that you might find are executive coaching, career or life coaching, performance coaching. So those are all different examples there. In terms of who drives the relationship with coaching, tends to be more around, can be more a little bit of the coach, in that they, almost act as a consultant. They're uncovering those areas of improvement, and they have like an idea of, okay, for session 2, 3, 4, this is what I think we should go into. Versus in mentorship, it can be a little bit more driven by the mentee of kind of building out what that journey looks like. And then the last thing I will say about coaching as well is that if it is paid, which services like BetterUp and Torch offer, then definitely it is more reserved for high potential talent, managers, and leadership. It's not something that is necessarily affordable for an organization to purchase for everybody. And so those are kind of some of the differences. And just, I know I've been rambling a little bit, but just to square it off with mentorship, essentially, the mentor doesn't necessarily have to be certified or qualified, could just be someone with more experience than you in a certain topic. Tends to be non-evaluative, which is could be nice for the mentee, depending on what they're looking for. And the mentee is really driving the relationship forward. I think what is best really depends on what the mentee or coachee is looking for, and kind of how evaluative, how formal they want it to be.
Awesome. I appreciate you taking that pretty deep dive into the differences, because again, like you said, and they can't be used interchangeably, but they do serve two very different purposes. I think, a lot of companies kind of throw the terms around a lot, and they're like, oh, we're going to get coaches. Oh, we're going to get mentors. And it's kind of confusing. So I think almost to like double down, like the first thing you should ever do in a mentorship program is define what mentorship looks like for your organization. I think that was a great call out. And I just want to really kind of reiterate that, because I think, again, lots of times we talk a lot about, let's put in a mentorship program without actually thinking about what does it actually mean for our organization. And like, I want to talk a little bit about, like, we talked about the differences. What is a mentor versus a coach? But now let's talk about what makes a great mentor. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what a mentor has to be. So I'd love to hear your opinion on what a great mentor looks like. And again, anyone who's watching in our audience, I'd also love for you to throw out some adjectives around what a great mentor looks like to you, or what great mentors you've experienced. So Nathan, I'll throw it back over to you, but what does a great mentor look like to you? And have you experienced great mentorship? I mean, you kind of teased it a little bit in your introduction.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I actually have experienced both mentorship and coaching. I've done both, the paid coaching situation, and I've also done just kind of standard mentorship where, the mentor wasn't being paid for it. And there's a few factors, and this is something that we try to bake into how we do product development, but also something that if you've ever been in these sessions, you would have noticed these things. Number one is they invest time. You definitely will notice when the mentor is investing time versus when they're not. They need to invest time to understand your goals specifically, to be able to have recurring meetings, because if you only have one meeting, you don't have as much progress that you can speak to. They put effort in between meetings, whether to kind of stay in touch with you, make introductions to people who might be helpful, find more resources. So it's something that happens between meetings as well. And what's interesting is, based on actually the prior question, you could, if that's what you're looking for, you could almost define it as a good mentor is someone who's acting more towards the spectrum of a coach, where they're looking to track my progress, be very involved, evaluative, etc. It kind of depends, this last one, on what you're looking for. But that's all about investing time. A couple other things that make a good mentor are eager to learn from the experience of being a mentor, which I think particularly has to do with taking your experiences, summarizing them and generalizing them, and then applying them to the mentee scenario. Nothing is less useful than super general advice that, like, you can't connect the dots between your situation and what they're saying. And I've noticed that the best mentors and coaches I've had can really figure out the specifics of my situation and apply the advice and find the right answer. So I think that's really important. And then just a couple other points. Keeps confidentiality and is non-judgmental. Sometimes you speak to someone a lot more senior, and you're always worried when you're speaking to someone more senior as a mentor of how you're coming across. So I think the more that you can create that environment of that you're not being judged or evaluated is helpful. And the last one is knows what they can and can't help with based on their expertise. I think that it's really easy to just kind of have an opinion on everything, but what's really great as a mentor is if there's certain things that you're an expert in, you help with that. And if there isn't something, then introduce the mentee to somebody who is.
Well, I love that last point. And I think there's a level of self-awareness that comes along with that, of just like, what are you actually really good at? What are you not so good at? Or, you still have a lot of time to grow or learn yourself in. One thing I would like to add around this is, like, I think there is a misconception that mentors always have to be more senior people in an organization. They've got to be the managers, the executives, the leaders, which personally, my philosophy is that everyone can be a mentor. It really just depends on what you are most capable in. And you can mentor someone who's a lot older than you in a subject that you're very proficient in, that they're less proficient in. And so it's one of the things that I've always loved about mentorship, is that it is very much a two-way street, that people can learn from each other. And I just put sort of in the comments of, like, one of the things that I think makes a great mentor is that they also need to be open to learning. And so they're learning from the mentee as much as the mentee is learning from the mentor.
Totally.
Cool.
I totally
Awesome.
agree.
I love it. I love it. And so now that we've kind of defined, like, what a great mentor looks like, what mentorship actually is, let's move on to, like, actually building out that mentorship program. How do you pick mentors for the program? What if you don't have enough mentors? Like, how do you tackle these challenges? If you're a smaller organization, you may not have enough mentors. Or if you're a huge organization, how do you, narrow the pool down enough that you have really good mentors? So I'd love to hear how you're working with your clients and with your prospects to kind of define those parameters.
Yeah, no, I love this question. It's something I'm super passionate about because we spend a lot of time on this on our side, developing mentoring programs. And, the title of the webinar is How to Drive Continuous Learning. I think it is really important to involve as many people as possible when it comes to mentorship programs. And sometimes, one of the primary observations that I've seen, having seen thousands of mentorship programs launched at our customers, is that HR teams often limit the access or scope of a program due to wanting a specific qualification of who can be a mentor. And similarly, I think it's a common practice and misconception that a mentorship program should have people designated only as mentees and only as mentors separately. And I think everyone on the call knows that typically an organization is a pyramid structure. So if you are going to have some kind of qualification process based on seniority, you're generally going to run into problems with the number of mentors that you can find. What we've learned is that the highest impact programs are the ones that do reach the entire organization, that create a culture of continuous learning across everybody, not just a small pool of people. And so to do that, you can't limit who can be a mentor so strictly and have what I call an absolute requirement for who can be a mentor. On the contrary, what we recommend is having a relative requirement. So rather than absolute, relative on who can be a mentor. And the best way to describe that is just a couple examples. So example one would be, instead of mentors having to be a senior manager or higher, mentors have to be one level higher than mentees. That way, all of a sudden now a senior individual contributor can be a mentor to someone who just started at the company, or maybe someone 1 year in can mentor an intern. So that's one example. An even more granular way to do it is actually to say, instead of mentors having to be more experienced in all skill sets than a mentee, mentors can be relatively more skilled in just one thing. So for example, say Python coding or project management. If someone is maybe less senior than you, but they're an expert in those two things, they can mentor you around that specific topic despite the seniority gap. And so I have a couple more points on that, but Noah, does that make sense so far? Do you have any questions on that absolute versus relative qualification?
I don't have any questions about it. It makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's just building on to what I was just saying earlier of like, everyone kind of has something to offer. And I don't know if you're going to get into it, but the first thing that pops into my mind is just like an HR leader is like, how am I going to convince, and maybe you're going to get to this, maybe not, but I'm going to ask it anyways. How am I going to convince those senior managers, those directors, those VPs to put themselves into a mentee position with maybe like a frontline manager or somebody who does have more experience in something? We're humans. There's lots of ego that comes along with being a human being. And so if you have any advice for HR leaders in kind of having to get around that, I think I'd love to. I think our audience would be really interested. I would be personally interested myself, because I think that is a pushback that I do hear often from other HR leaders. Just like, well, there's no way my VP of finance or people would listen to like a TA specialist. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that there needs to be some, I guess, empathy or practical limits to how far you can stretch that relative mentor definition. Certainly, like, there's been some popularity around reverse mentoring where you really do have that, like, the younger folks specifically, maybe they're good at AI or something like that, and the VPs are interested in that. You really have to have buy-in at the org level among these executives that there's this huge skill gap that we have as this, more senior generation around, say, AI. And we really need to learn in a reverse mentoring format in that case about this. And we're all bought in. But I think that just one VP learning from someone who's much more junior to them about, say, project management is a harder stretch. I think where that more so applies is just in kind of more the mid level of the organization pyramid, where as an example, you're an engineer specifically trained on this area, and then someone else that's a little bit more junior than you is trained in another specific area that you're interested in. That could really work for that person being a mentor to you. So I do think there's kind of either practical limits or an organization level buy-in that has to occur for that to work really well. And then, just to comment on my earlier point a little bit more, I think that those absolute requirements for mentors, they're just going to limit the size of the audience that you have based on how many mentors you're going to have. So it's still okay to do, especially for like a high potential program or a program with very specific scope. Then go for it. Have like a really specific mentor designation. But for something that's going to reach all employees, we really do recommend the more relative approach like that.
Oh, I love it. Awesome. I think it kind of like goes back to like, what is the definition of mentorship in your organization? What's the goal of the program? What are you trying to do? So if it is really much like this is a perk for our high potential employees only, then as you said, have more of those absolutes in place. And I think we touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into like, you talked a little bit about it of like mentorship at the different levels within an organization. What does it look like at the individual contributor level? What does it look at a manager level? What does it look like at that executive level? And how does those interactions flow across the organization to make sure, like, sort of to the title of the webinar, you're building a culture of continuous learning, and that applies for all levels of the organization, not just your most junior employees.
Right. Well, we definitely see a need for mentorship at every level, and that there's always an opportunity to have a ton of development regardless of your seniority. And we can just work our way up the pyramid here. I think the first obvious one is an internship program. It's very helpful for those, 3, 4, 8 months, however long your interns are at the organization, to have a mentor. It doesn't have to be a ton more senior than them, but that's one example of where you can start offering this. Similarly, onboarding buddy program of some kind, maybe 6 months of their onboarding, they're meeting with somebody. When it comes to individual contributor level, I think you tend to see maybe some focus on department-specific skills, like, for example, sales folks trading ideas about sales. Then you get to being a new manager. And what we really see there is a ton of support needed, either in a traditional mentor that is maybe a more senior manager or director, or even peer-to-peer, where you just put new managers together and say, like, holy, here's what I'm struggling with, like, let's talk this through together. So I think that's a good kind of senior level type of program. We also see high potential talent, pairing, some of your most high potential talent with VPs or C-suite as well. And then there's also a lot of other creative use cases that are not, say, tenure based. Noah, for example, just ERGs, employee resource groups like Women At, for example, or even we've seen language buddies used where, you're pairing somebody who's fluent in one language looking to learn another together. And that's really helpful sometimes for more like multinational organizations. So it doesn't have to necessarily be tenure based. One thing I will call out is that if you are involving some of those more senior folks like VPs or senior managers, et cetera, and the C-suite, then an obvious thing to just be conscious of is time commitment and logistics. I think that having, personal assistants involved in terms of coordinating the calendar and meetings so that, like, if a high potential mentee is matched with a VP, they're really liaising a lot with the assistant, if applicable, and then just having really good agendas and resources for the mentee so that the senior executive doesn't have to worry about meeting prep. They can just look at the agenda 5 minutes before, join the call, and be useful. So I think those two things are super important in those cases.
I love how you called out that preparation and those resources and those frameworks that are so often overlooked, but are like critical to the success of any sort of program, whether it's mentorship or any other people program, of just like, how can we get the most amount of preparation in front of people to make this relationship successful for everyone involved, because it'll benefit the VP, it'll benefit the high potential, and it'll benefit the company as a whole, because we get to keep this high potential employee longer. They're learning skills that are then driving the business forward. The VP, often it will enjoy the mentorship relationship. Like, if you look at all the different surveys out there, whether it's Gallup or HR Reporter or whatever, they all report that, like, when mentors have the opportunity to mentor somebody, their engagement goes up, their happiness levels in the organization go up, and whatnot. So I think it's really critical to define all of those steps, as you're saying, before you launch a program, and make sure that, you're equipping your mentors and your mentees for success. I really like it. And so, we've kind of walked down the path of, like, we've defined it. We know what a great mentor looks like. We're talked a bit about how do you pick mentors for a program, what mentorship programs you can kind of look at, how does this look at different organizational levels. But now let's kind of jump into, like, why would you want to have a mentorship program? We talk about continuous learning and whatnot. And we talk a little bit about helping the business grow, but like, why? What can you accomplish? What is the purpose? And then, as everyone wants to know, as soon as you start putting, budget towards something, how do you measure the success of a program? That's the biggest one. And I'm sure every CFO that every HR person watching will have to go to is, what's the ROI on this? How are you going to measure success of this program?
Yeah. Well, one of the favorite things that I've learned over time with running mentorship programs, and I think the most important takeaway from this question, is that mentorship programs are a medium to solve many potential problems that you have. It's not necessarily always measured by the same specific outcome or rigid metric. And a really easy analogy to understand this is, for example, exercise. Everyone might have different goals: to live longer, to be more confident, maybe to have a pastime to share with a partner. Exercise is a tool to accomplish a number of those different goals, and you can tailor it according to which of those, success looks like to you. And the same thing is the case with mentorship. So there is continuous learning, of course, which has, is about what skills people are building and are we adapting to the needs of the market at any time. But there's so many common success metrics that you can use to measure. So I think a few examples we hear all the time are like quotes like, our organization ran a survey and learning and development was ranked lowest among all scorers. And so the problem is that people do not feel like the organization focuses on their development, just their output. Another quote we often hear is, our organization doesn't have good promotion rates of minorities. We want more diversity in leadership roles. A couple more are, our organization has a large retiring population and we want to pass the knowledge down as much as possible. Our organization has a retention issue and we want people to feel more supported. Our organization transitioned to remote work and people feel isolated and disconnected. All of these can be solved through the medium of mentorship. And that's what I love the most about the power of mentorship programs. And so you can tailor that in each case to solve those problems. So the remote work one, for example, might be a program open to everybody that enforces cross-department connections. So you're not allowed to be matched with someone in your own department. The diversity program might focus on a small cohort of high potential talent, matching them with C-suite. We've seen that a number of times. And you could choose a metric for each of these, like number of minorities in leadership positions or retention rates of employees in and outside of the program. The one thing that I do love to call out for those who are really obsessed with measuring ROI of what they're doing is I really encourage all your metrics to have an A/B test or like a control group where you're measuring the metric among those who participated in the program and then those that didn't. And I think that's where you really start to not be able to blame like seasonality or external factors on the business or organization that might have caused those changes, but then say, okay, in the program, people had a higher retention rate than the same period outside of the program. And I think that's a nice way to show ROI.
Cool. I love that you call that out. We often say very similar things to our clients of like, start with your control group. Maybe it's one department or not. And then, prove the success there and then expand it out to the whole organization of just like, look how much impact this program has had on our marketing department or our Midwest, cost center or whatever you want, however you define it as an organization. And then you can, you do that for 6 months to a year and you're like, look at all of our metrics that have gone up, our retention has gone up, our engagement has gone up, our happiness levels have gone up, career prospects have gone up, promotions have gone up, like everything goes up when you implement these types of programs. Like, proof is in the pudding. Now let's roll it out to the rest of the organization. And it'll also help you work out all the kinks and the bugs and the things that go wrong when you roll out a new program as well.
Yeah.
All right. I love it. And like, I like that you called out, I really liked your analogy around like exercise of like, it really is a tool that can solve lots of problems. And it's not the only tool, but it is a very impactful tool. Mentorship programs are very impactful. They build connection, they build community. And in this world of remote and hybrid, where people feel so much more isolation than they normally do, I feel like mentorship can also just increase people's mental well-being as well, because that's one thing that people are struggling with. Of like, when you're building connections with your coworkers, you're also building that mental muscle as well.
Yeah, well, pre-pandemic, no, I think some people had objections to organizing mentorship formally, being like, that's an organic thing. People should just bump into each other in the halls and figure out who their mentor is. But I think in this new world, it's very obvious that it needs to be kind of taken seriously and a little more formally by the organization.
Yeah, I think it's like, if it's, that timeless saying of like, what's gets measured gets done. And it's sort of the same thing here of like, if you're not going to formally introduce the program, it's not going to happen. It might happen for really keen managers and really keen individuals, but if then you get these pockets of inequity and inconsistency across the organization, which is never great. You want to make sure that, you're creating an equitable program for as many people as possible. I really like that you called that out. And I think you're right. Pre-pandemic, there was a lot of that'll happen organically. Now people are like, nope, we got to actually take this seriously and put more effort into it. So let's talk a little bit about just like, how do you build out a mentorship program? Like what are the practical steps? Like, what is the first thing that an HR person like myself, who's kind of bought in? I think most people who are watching this are like, yeah, mentorship is a good thing. How would I roll one out at my organization? What are the steps involved? Who do I need to get involved? What are the things I should be looking for if I'm going to be using, a third-party provider like Together, or if I need to build something in-house because I don't have a lot of budget?
Yeah, and I think what I'm about to share on this is really regardless of whether you plan on using software or not. It is just kind of common things that you would do in either case. We just talked about goals. I think the first thing is set the goals. What's going to be the kind of the outcome that we're measuring here out of this. And it could be, again, a number of things based on what the organization is facing today, retention, et cetera. Next, I think buy-in from senior leaders, I think, is really important. Generally, mentorship programs are not just in one department, can be across the entire organization. And so what buy-in helps with is not just them participating as mentors or anything like that, but also you're going to need to do a bit of a marketing push to register people and have them join, right? And some of the most successful programs that I've seen in terms of participation is when at the town hall for the entire company of 5,000 people, they're making an announcement of, we're launching a mentorship program. You get like 2,000 people signing up the next day. So that's kind of why you need that executive buy-in. And to do that, sometimes it's helpful to create a business case. One thing that you could even do is you might have an instinct or sense that I think we need a mentorship program to solve some of the things that I'm seeing. But maybe what you want to do is actually run a survey first and collect feedback about how do you feel about learning and development, or show demand for mentorship. Would you sign up for a mentorship program if we ran one next quarter? So I think that can really help build a proposal, create your goals and KPIs, et cetera. Then I think you want to define what the structure is going to be of that program. We think of it in terms of a few different parameters. So we think of it in terms of whether it's going to be one-on-one sessions or group sessions. Those are both options, and I think have their own benefits and advantages. How frequently you want to meet, and then the duration of those relationships, and a few of those different kinds of parameters. And so once you have that structure, it's easier to start building those marketing materials and try to explain what it's going to be. So we've got some resources we can share after the call on different ways to structure your mentorship program. You can, even in terms of duration, you can think of it as this is going to be a cohort, 6 months, one time, we're going to see how it goes, or this is evergreen, it's continuous, it's always open, you can sign up anytime, and we'll get you a match. So those are a few things to think about. And then, just a budget, I think, as well. This could be headcount in terms of how many admins are we going to have running this thing? Are we going to budget any room for software, et cetera? And then finally, you need to make sure you're going to measure the success. So we like to tell you to have a baseline measurement of what your what you're looking to improve, and then a way to measure success afterwards, whether that's via survey or some of your HR data analytics to help with that. So those are a few steps that you can take.
Awesome. I love it. It's very practical, and something just kind of popped into my head as we were chatting of just like, you're measuring, you got your baseline. I love that you suggest, let's put out a survey before we even launch the program, see if people are interested, see how people are feeling about their learning and development or mentorship capabilities. One thing that kind of popped into my head, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it as well, is like, what do you do in the situations where, a mentor and a mentee have been paired up, but it is not working? And one of that pair has come to you and says, this isn't working. I need to be, put with somebody else. How do you navigate that situation, as it will happen because, just some people just don't get along?
Yeah. So I don't want to talk too much about software. I want this to be useful universally. I think that one of the things that software does help with is it allows you to get much more sophisticated in terms of these kinds of problems. So for example, one way you could try to do this is to organize an initial introductory session for everybody with the mentor match. And then they'll come back to you with an understanding of what was the chemistry like, is this a good fit or not, and then everybody gets to opt into continuing the match or not. And I think that's one way to do it. If you do have software, you can actually just enforce it so that everyone gets one match, and then extending is optional, and then everyone can find another match for one session and decide whether to extend. It definitely does happen. And another thing to consider is just at the time people signed up, they said they had availability to do this, and then a month later something can happen, and it always happens that life comes up and then you need to find another match. So maybe baking in just like a milestone point of where we can decide whether we continue or not, and then allowing a chance to rematch at that point is probably our biggest recommendation.
Cool. Awesome. I really like that. And then I'd also like, again, just another thing popping into my brain as we're kind of talking of like, how do you talk about, or how do you kind of advise your clients or whomever about like, how do you build this into like a performance review, right? Like, so like, this is technically like, out of scope of role, unless it's part of your competencies, which is great, but most companies probably not. So how do you make sure that, like, this is probably one of those non-promotable tasks that a lot of people will take on because they think it's really important and they like it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's, more promotable for the person, the mentee, but how do you make sure that it's, evaluated in somebody's performance review as a mentor? I'm doing my full-time job plus, 30 minutes a week to an hour every 2 weeks or whatever the time frame is of like doing the meeting, prepping between meetings, and then doing the next meeting. It's a few hours a week, month, whatever. How do we make sure that like that is actually being called out and let's say recognized or taken into account when it comes time to promote people or give them salary raises, because that's what we're all after when we're in a career.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. The basics are making sure that you can report on participation of, how many matches does everybody have? And secondly, you could also layer that on with surveys about satisfaction of every match. So then you could say, not only do I have 3 matches, but they tend to say really good things about whether I'm being useful to them or not. The more that you have software, the more you can get even more specific about, like, we can actually in a mentorship program tell you the leaderboard in terms of minutes of mentorship of, this mentor has contributed 1,000 minutes of mentorship and so on. And so then you could take that report around to all the managers and use that. But yeah, reporting is the critical thing here. And you don't necessarily want to have everybody volunteer their report and say, hey, by the way, manager, I've been doing this. It would be nice that it's actually an expectation that the HR team just gives all the managers the report regardless, and that you don't have to self-advocate for yourself. That's one way that you as an organization and leadership team can really promote continuous learning, is to say, hey, by the way, like, this is actually going to be baked into performance, is we're going to collect this report every 6 months on how much mentorship people have been doing.
Cool. I love it. And I think like it's almost like building it into your competencies. This is an expectation as an organization. We're going to pull this into the competencies, and this is how it's going to show up at each different level of the organization, and making time for it. We talked a little bit about like pitching to executives, and one thing that I always like to tell folks, and I think you had some really great points around like, getting that buy-in and making sure that that buy-in is happening, and having those big announcements at those all hands and those town halls to really drive engagement from the front line. And when you're trying to get that buy-in, one thing that I have always found really successful, getting that buy-in across the board of the senior leadership team, or at least most people, is really finding that one or two allies on the senior leadership team. You can almost always find at least one or two people who will think mentorship is a great idea and we should do this because they've had great experiences in it. And so getting them on board and maybe pitching it as like, we're going to experiment with this leader's department and see how it goes, because you'll be much more likely to have success there because they're bought in and they want their team to have that new tool, that new, kind of perk that not everyone else is having, and then they can help you sort of launch it across the organization. So just one thing I wanted to add about, pitching to executives, find that ally on that team that can kind of go along with you and help you make that pitch to the rest of the team.
I totally agree. I think you could almost think of it in two different phases. It's critical to get those senior ally buy-in situations at the beginning when launching the program for the first time. That's going to get you that initial amount of participation. And then I think it's critical over time that a lot of the word of mouth comes from the participants too. And then you start to say, okay, wow, this colleague of mine has been in it for 6 months. They're finding it really useful. I'm going to sign up too. But when nobody has ever tried it or really knows about it, the buy-in from the leadership is critical.
Cool. Love it. So let's talk about, the way we work has changed dramatically since the pandemic, and we're all over the place, and there's all the arguments in the news about in-office versus remote versus hybrid. I don't think any of these models are really going away. That's, it's all here to stay and just kind of company preference. But what does mentorship look like in these different environments where you have, let's talk about like the fully remote distributed sort of tech company versus the hybrid organization that's got your corporate office plus your frontline employees, whether they're retail or manufacturing or hospitality. What does mentorship look like in these different situations, and how do you as an organization make sure that it is equitable across kind of all different locations?
Yep. Yeah. That's a good question. And Noah, what I would say is I'm going to admit that my level of expertise tends to be more in the remote and office environments rather than say the frontline, but I can give some commentary on all of these. I think that what we tend to see, at least in terms of use of software for mentorship to support a program, is that tends to be more prominent in remote and office environments, specifically where folks have an email address and an email license at their organization. Whereas I think frontline workers not always necessarily have that in an organization. And so in those frontline cases, I think you can certainly run manual programs based on the same principles. You just may have to keep in mind that those cohorts are a little bit more regional, and maybe fewer connections on a global scale. Tends to be maybe harder to capture everyone's preferences and then match across different locations or things like that. So try to apply the same principles as you can, but maybe you'll probably have to do it manually if folks don't have an email address or something like that. You might be able to still use personal emails if that's within company policy. And then in remote scenarios, I think obviously a lot of the meetings start to happen through Teams and Zoom. But if you are in the office, what we see our customers do is take advantage of that to turn some of the programming and events into in-person, like, for example, a kickoff for the mentorship program or a mid-program check-in. Those can be actually in person. A lot of the times we've seen like really interesting retros halfway through where people will talk about what things are going well, what things aren't going well. You can even like have half the room be mentors, half the room be mentees, and kind of exchange ideas that way. So those more event kind of milestones for a program are definitely helpful to be in person. And then similarly with the way to promote your program is those in-person town halls, conferences, or anything like that is a really good chance to get people to sign up when they're in person. So those are a few things I see there. If you have any other things that you've noticed about different environments, be happy to hear.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about like the like with remote, it is, you're probably working a lot with, like you said, Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Slack or whatever. But really, if you can, have you seen any organizations that provide, like, I'm going to say a budget outside of like just paying for software, but like, here's a lunch budget for you and your mentor to get together if you're regionally in the same spot, just to kind of build that more personal connection?
For sure. Actually, a former employer that inspired some of the features at Together Software, they actually had like a company Starbucks card that was available at the front desk, and you check that out. There's a transaction limit, whatever, and you can take somebody out for a coffee anytime, any day, on the company budget. Now that's an in-person version. I'm sure you could find some tool to help you do that remotely, but it's also a great way to encourage that extra budget to be spent on promoting mentorship.
Cool. Love it. Love it. And I think like, and I'm just like waxing poetic riffing here about like with the frontline environments of just it's really going to be about arming and supplying those regional managers and those store managers or location managers with, again, those tools and those resources that you talked about earlier, of like really make it easy for them to initiate the program and support them in getting it going, and then also really make it apparent of why we're doing this as an organization and what the benefits will be for them and their location, not even just the business as a whole. Because like when you're a store manager, you're running around, you're doing so much. And so like make it really easy for them and be like, if we do this and it's successful, your retention rates could go up by 20, 30, 40%, which means that you have to spend, X weeks less time hiring people, which is always a big thing in sort of those frontline environments.
Makes sense.
And I'm gonna pull this up. I like this one right here. More peer-to-peer in the front line. Love it. Great call out, Bo. Definitely probably gonna be happening a lot more in the front line of pairing those more seasoned, experienced people on the floor with newer, more junior employees and setting them up for those mentorship programs.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely heard of in the retail use case, even having like the managers of stores come together within the region to discuss. I mean, often they're talking metrics and things like that, and how are sales over like Black Friday, but maybe adding a mentorship element to that where they can just add another 30 minutes of peer-to-peer discussion more holistically is a great call.
Cool. Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Well, I think we've run through all of the questions that we initially had to talk about. If anyone has any questions that's watching, we'd love to answer those. Drop them in the comments. I have one question just to kind of like get things rolling. But how, we've run into this with recognition programs, and I know it's something that's kind of top of mind for a lot of organizations. And you talked a little bit about it of like, DEI, how do we make sure that like we're rolling this out equitably? How would you sort of advise HR leaders on making sure that when they are rolling out a mentorship program, that it is very equitable? Like what kind of guardrails or reports or things would you really want them to have in place to make sure that it isn't just, the manager mentoring their favorite person on the team, but they are doing it to, everyone who wants that mentorship and is doing it to the same level for everyone who's involved?
Yeah. So it gives two elements that you can think of. One is what your matching criteria are that you can kind of rig in to make sure that those are producing equitable results. And two is, as you said, reporting. Reporting really helps as well. So I'll talk about each of those. Like on the matching side, whether or not you're using software, you can come up with a bunch of interesting criteria that can help you really get the results you want. As we talked about, not being able to get matched within your own department is an interesting one. Another one is using reporting lines to say not matching with anyone that is, your manager, your manager's manager, or even reports to the same manager as you. Those are all kind of different examples. And you can get into more interesting ones like things based on, employee resource group involvement, et cetera. So I think matching criteria is a really good way to make sure you get what you want if it's not a free-for-all. And then two is on the reporting side, what we tend to encourage is that even if you don't want to use certain identity questions for matching, like, for example, gender or like minority or ERG involvement, even if you don't want to use that for matching, maybe make that like an admin only hidden thing so that at least you can report. Because one of the important things is to say, like, how many, and a common one that a customer would do is how many women versus men are participating in the program. What are the outcomes for both of those, et cetera. You can cut that any way you want, whatever you're interested in. But if you don't know the information about the users, then it's hard to ensure that you're doing the right thing. So I'd say those are two possible areas to explore.
Cool. Awesome. I love it. I think it's one of those things that, like, you got to be really intentional about, as you said, of like, maybe it's not about the matching side of things, but if you're not kind of slicing the data to really encompass your demographic data, you're not going to see how some groups are succeeding and how some groups might be being left behind.
It really helps also to be monitoring that as the registration is going on for a mentorship program. So what we tend to see is registration periods can be 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And so you could be a week in, 2 weeks in, and start to spot areas where you're missing folks. And you can run a little targeted campaign in those areas if you're missing a certain department or a certain demographic that you're interested in having more participation from.
Cool. I love it. Awesome. Well, that's kind of all the questions that I've had. And thanks, Nathan, for all the information. I found it very insightful. I got a lot out of it. I hope our audience did as well. I don't see any questions popping in from the audience. So I think kind of with that, we'll give everyone a few minutes back of their day and say thanks for, joining us today on what it means to create a culture of learning through mentorship. If you want to connect with either myself or Nathan, we're dropping our LinkedIn links into the chat. So if you're on YouTube, you'll see those being dropped in on the YouTube comments. And if you're on LinkedIn, you'll see it's been dropped in on the LinkedIn comments. We will be sending the recording out after the fact. So if you registered, you will get a recording of this, plus some great resources from the Together platform folks on just kind of like what it means to make a mentorship program. How do you do that? So look out for that in your email. Thanks again, Nathan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Noah.
We'll see everybody later. Cheers.